The fluorescent lights of the downtown clinic flickered softly overhead, humming their quiet lullaby to the waiting room's silence. It was late, the kind of late that bled into early morning, and most of the city had folded into sleep. But inside this weathered little free clinic nestled between a boarded-up pawn shop and a long-forgotten bookstore, Nurse Mara Hale moved with calm precision, her presence a balm to the worn-out walls and tired lives that shuffled through them. She was known in this corner of the city as kind, not the performative kind but the quiet, unshakable kind. She offered warm compresses and eye contact, she remembered names, she gave people dignity without announcing it. Her colleagues often wondered why she chose this place when she could have easily worked at the polished, better-paying hospital uptown. But Mara had made her choice years ago, after a grief she rarely spoke of except through her actions. This was where she felt she was most needed. This was where she still felt him. It was nearly 2:30 a.m. when the front door creaked open with the kind of hesitation that spoke of discomfort, even shame. Mara glanced up from the chart she was updating and saw a man step inside, stooped slightly, one hand wrapped in a tattered towel that had turned a worrying shade of rust red. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, hidden beneath a hooded coat that had seen too many seasons, and his beard was thick enough to obscure most of his face. He stood just inside the threshold, as if unsure whether he'd made a mistake. "You're welcome to come in," Mara said gently, already standing. "We're open." He didn't speak at first, his eyes flickered to hers, dark and unreadable, then down to his hand. Slowly, he stepped forward. "Got anything left for a hand like this?" His voice was rough with disuse, but not uneducated. "I've got time," she said, motioning toward the exam room. He hesitated again, glancing around like he expected someone to change their mind and shove him back out the door. When no one did, he followed her down the narrow hallway, the sound of his boots dragging slightly against the linoleum. Inside the room, she gestured for him to sit. He did, with a kind of careful weariness that spoke not just of exhaustion but of long practice at making himself small. She pulled on gloves and gently reached for the towel. "May I?" He gave a short nod, eyes on the floor. She unwrapped it slowly, mindful of the way he flinched as the fabric pulled away. The wound was ugly, deep, jagged, still oozing. A cut from something metal, maybe glass, days old, infected. "This should have been cleaned a while ago," she murmured. "I didn't have a while," he muttered. She didn't ask questions, not yet. Instead, she set to work, cleaning the wound with quiet efficiency, the kind that reassured without words. He hissed once sharply but didn't pull away. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, how he clenched his free hand into a fist. "Breathe," she said, almost softly enough for it to be mistaken for a whisper. He looked up at her, then really looked. His eyes were a stormy blue, shot through with fatigue and something else, loss maybe. Recognition flickered across his face for a fraction of a second, quickly swallowed. "You one of those nurses that talks people through pain?" She smiled faintly, only if they night it. "I'm fine. Of course." She wrapped his hand with fresh gauze, secure but not too tight. Her touch was practiced, but more than that, it was kind. "You'll need antibiotics," she said, reaching for a sample packet. "And you'll have to come back to change the bandage. Infection like this doesn't just vanish." Something flickered across his face, not quite amusement, not quite fear. "I can't promise that," he said. "Can't or whoa." He gave her a long look. Some promises aren't safe to make. She didn't press, she was used to patients with shadows behind their eyes. "I'll give you enough for 3 days, after that it's your call." "Generous." She looked up at him. You'd be surprised how rare it is to have someone sit still long enough for proper care. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. Something in him eased, if only by a thread. As she finished bandaging him, she glanced at his other hand. Calloused, not from nothing, from years of something, not the kind of roughness that came from panhandling or addiction. This man had worked with his hands once, maybe still did in his own way. "I'm Mara," she said. He hesitated. "Call me Tom." It was a name she would learn later wasn't real, but in that moment it was enough. Enough to anchor the quiet bond forming in the hush between heartbeats and gauze. He stood, and for a second he looked like he might say something more, but then he nodded once and turned for the door. "Tom," she called softly before he left. He paused. "You don't have to disappear," she said, "not from here." He didn't turn around. "Thanks," he said, and then he was gone. But he'd be back, something in her knew that, and what she didn't know, what no one did, was that the man she'd just bandaged was one of the most wanted names in American finance. Vanished without a trace 5 years ago, declared dead by most, remembered in hushed tones by those who once dined at his table. He didn't look like a billionaire now. He looked like someone who'd lost everything. And in truth, maybe he had. But in the warmth of a nurse's hands, something forgotten had stirred again, something like hope. The rain started 3 nights later, just after midnight, steady and cold, the kind that soaked through seams and left the city smelling like rust and pavement. Mara was restocking gauze in the back room when she heard the door creak again. It wasn't unusual for someone to come in during storms, drawn by the promise of warmth more than medicine. Still, she felt something shift in the air, like a soft tension, expectant and almost familiar. When she walked out, he was already sitting in the same chair he had before. Hood pulled low, coat darker from the rain. His hand rested on the edge of the table, the bandage damp but intact. "You came back," she said, not hiding her surprise. He looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. Rain got mean. "You could have gone anywhere." "No," he said quietly, "I couldn't." She motioned for him to follow. This time he rose without hesitation. In the exam room, she peeled off the wet bandage and examined the wound. It was healing, though slower than she liked. The infection hadn't spread, which was something. "You took the antibiotics." "I did," he said, then after a pause, "I don't usually follow instructions." "I'm honored," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. He glanced around the room as she worked. His gaze settled briefly on the window, then the framed poster listing symptoms of diabetes, then finally on the worn photo pinned beside the supply cabinet. A young boy with a gap-toothed grin and eyes too big for his face. "Yours?" he asked. Mara didn't look up. "Yes." "Still around?" She paused, tying the new bandage. "No, he passed 4 years ago." His silence was heavy, respectful. "I'm sorry." "My too." He didn't ask how, didn't offer platitudes. Just sat quietly with the kind of stillness that comes from someone who's known their own deep ache. She appreciated that. "You said your name was Tom," she said after a moment. He nodded once, guarded. "That real?" He met her gaze. "As yours." She let out a soft huff of breath, not quite a laugh. "Touché." Silence settled again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something in it, something slow building, not trust, not yet, but an understanding. "You used to be someone else," she said gently, not a question. He didn't flinch. "Didn't we all?" "I don't mean just in the way life changes you. I mean really. I see the way you carry yourself. You're not lost, not the way some are." He was quiet for a long time, then said, "I was good at vanishing. Turns out I needed to be." "Dangerous people. Dangerous choices." She finished wrapping his hand and stepped back. "You're not the only one who's had to become someone new." That caught him off guard. He looked at her, then really looked. For a second, the guardedness cracked. "What was your old life like?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. She walked to the sink, peeled off her gloves, and washed her hands slowly. "Louder," she said at last, "full of plans. I thought I had time. I was married once, had a little house with blue shutters, everything was scheduled. Then Ben got sick, my husband couldn't handle it, he left, I stayed." His brow furrowed, "The boy in the photo." She nodded. "Leukemia, diagnosed at 5, gone at 7. There was no tremble in her voice, just a quiet, enduring strength, like weathered stone that had been shaped by years of storm. He rubbed his face with his good hand. "People say grief passes. I don't think that's true." "No," she said, "it just learns to live beside you. You make room." He looked down. "I had a sister once. She used to say something like that." "What happened to her?" His fingers curled reflexively. "Same thing that happened to the rest of my family. My success made me their gravity. When I disappeared, they floated off." She studied him. "You left them behind." "I thought I was protecting them. I thought leaving was the only way to stop the bleeding." "And was it?" His jaw tightened. "No, it was just a different kind of cut." She moved toward the door, her voice softer now. "You can't keep hiding forever." "Who says I'm hiding?" She paused, hand on the doorknob, "The way you won't meet your own eyes in the mirror." He didn't answer, but his silence said enough. That night as he left, she watched from the front desk, a thermos of soup in his hand. He didn't look back, but something had shifted. The rain was still falling, but his steps were steadier. She didn't know yet that his real name was Nathaniel Reed, the vanished financial mogul who had once owned 2 skyscrapers, 5 luxury cars, and a seat at every gala that mattered. He had been 28 when he made his first billion, 35 when the scandal hit, 37 when he vanished without a trace right before the trial. Some called it cowardice, others brilliance. No one had seen him since. Until now. He had nothing left but a name he no longer used and a wound that had forced him to walk into a place that offered warmth without question. And the woman inside, the one who never asked for payment, who saw through the fog of who he pretended to be, had undone something in him. Not with questions, with care. And that night, as he settled into his hidden corner of an abandoned train yard, soup warming his hands, he closed his eyes and let himself remember a time when he'd believed in second chances. Maybe, just maybe, he could believe again. By the time spring reached the city with its shy blossoms and scattered bursts of green, Nathaniel had become a fixture in the quiet hours of the clinic. Never regular, never predictable, but often enough that Mara began to look for him after midnight, listening for the particular rhythm of his footsteps, the way the door creaked slightly differently when it was him. He never stayed long, she never asked why. They spoke in pieces, sometimes just a few words exchanged while she cleaned the wound or checked for signs of reinfection. Other times, silence stretched between them like a shared language neither of them had known they were fluent in. She never pushed, and for that, he kept returning. His wound healed, she noticed he didn't mention where he stayed or how he fed himself. He didn't smell of alcohol or carry the tremors that came with withdrawal, but there was still a distance in him, a wariness not of her, but of being seen. One night in April, she found him sitting outside the clinic just after closing. The city was quieter than usual, the wind tugging at the hem of her coat. "You're early," she said, sitting beside him on the cold concrete steps. "I wasn't sure you'd still be open. I don't leave until everything's cleaned." He nodded, figured. He handed her a small, battered book. "Found this in the wreckage of an old church near the rail yard. Thought you might like it." She turned it over in her hands. Worn leather cover, faded title, A Manual for Living, Epictetus. Her brows lifted. "You read Stoic philosophy now." He shrugged, "Used to, long time ago." She opened it gently. Notes lined the margins in neat, deliberate handwriting. She looked up at him, curious. "Yours?" He nodded. "I used to underline things, thought it made me smarter." "What made you stop?" He hesitated. Smarter stopped helping. She didn't return the book, she held it close instead. "I'll read it," she said, "but only if you keep bringing me things to underline." He gave her a look that was almost a smile, but not quite. That night inside the clinic, they spoke more than they had before. "I used to think money made you safe," he said as she checked his healing hand. "If you had enough of it, you could outrun anything, grief, regret, even yourself." "Did it?" He looked down at the fresh bandage. "I'm here, are I?" She considered him. "There's something in you that still wants to be forgiven." He blinked slowly, as if the words had touched something he hadn't meant to reveal. "I don't deserve it," he said. "Maybe not," she replied softly, "but that doesn't mean you don't need it." For the first time, he stayed after the bandaging. They sat at the back of the clinic, sharing the last of the tea she kept in a chipped mug. He asked about her son, what he liked, what made him laugh. She told him about the little dance Ben used to do when he got good news, how he once insisted on naming a hospital goldfish Dr. Pancakes. Nathaniel laughed, full and genuine, and she saw a glimpse of the man he must have been before everything. And then he asked, "What would he think of what you're doing now?" Mara looked out the window. The city lights blinked like distant stars. "I think he'd be proud I kept showing up." He nodded, quietly thoughtful. "That's harder than people think." Later, when he left, he said her name for the first time without being prompted. "Thank you, Mara." She watched him walk into the night, something steady in his steps now. Weeks passed. Nathaniel started arriving with small offerings, a thermos of strong coffee from a battered camp stove, a scrap of poetry scribbled on a napkin, an old harmonica he never played but said reminded him of his grandfather. He never asked for more medicine, he didn't need it anymore. One night as she was locking up, he asked if he could walk her home. She hesitated, then nodded. They walked side by side through streets damp with spring rain, quiet as if the city were holding its breath. He didn't ask about the house with the blue shutters. She didn't ask where he slept. "Doesn't feel like I deserve this," he said softly. "What the walk? The kindness." She stopped and looked at him. "It's not something you earn, Nathaniel, it's something you allow." He flinched at the name, even though she hadn't meant to speak it. She saw it in the tightness of his jaw, the flash of something old and painful in his eyes. "You knew," he said. "I didn't until just now." He let out a breath, then shook his head. "I should have left a long time ago." "You don't have to run." I'm not running, I stopped knowing how to be seen. You're not invisible here. They stood beneath a flickering streetlight, rain speckling the concrete. Neither moved. What if they find me? He asked quietly. Then you face it, she said, but not alone. His eyes lifted to hers. Why are you doing this? Because someone once stayed when I was breaking, she said, and I remember what it meant. She reached for his hand, the one she'd bandaged all those weeks ago, now nearly healed. She held it gently, not to anchor him, but to remind him he didn't have to drift. And for the first time in years, he didn't pull away. Somewhere in the stillness between heartbeats, in the hush of a city waiting for morning, something began to mend. Not just the wound in his hand, but the deeper kind, the kind he'd buried under years of silence, shame, and solitude. Nathaniel Reed, the man the world believed dead, was beginning to come back to life. And he was doing it in the quiet company of a woman who offered no judgment, only warmth and a chair in the dark and the choice to be known. The clinic was quieter in the summer. The cold no longer drove people in by the dozen, and many of Mara's regulars drifted back to park benches and shelters that felt less suffocating in the warmth. But Nathaniel stayed. Not every night, not predictably, but enough. Sometimes he came by just to sit on the bench outside, not even entering. Mara would bring him a cup of tea when she noticed him, and they'd sit together in silence as the city exhaled around them. One night in June, he brought her a book of pressed flowers, handmade, pages from an old ledger sewn together with frayed thread. Each bloom had a name written in neat script: lavender, red clover, evening primrose. A few had notes scrawled beside them. Found near the old train depot, strong scent, fragile stem. Grew wild near the creek behind the church ruins. Mara ran her fingers over the page as if the petals still held warmth. You've got a good eye, she murmured. He shrugged, helps me stay still, makes things quiet inside. They were sitting in the back room, her shift nearly over, the clinic dim except for the soft lamplight. He hadn't come with any wounds that night, just the book. Have you ever thought of leaving the city? She asked, closing the ledger gently. He looked out the window. I think about it all the time. But you don't go. Too much memory here, and maybe, he paused, rubbing his thumb over a callus. Maybe I'm still trying to find some version of myself I don't hate. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not that man anymore. But I was. That matters less than you think. His eyes flicked to hers. You think I deserve peace. I think everyone deserves a place to heal, she said, even if it takes time to believe it. He swallowed hard. I tried to give all the money away. When I left, transferred most of it to charities, shelters, legal aid programs. She tilted her head. That's not something you ever mentioned. I wasn't looking for credit. No, she said, but I think part of you wanted to be seen as more than the scandal. He nodded slowly. I didn't know how to be a man anymore without the fortune. I thought maybe if I disappeared, I'd stop hurting people. You only stopped letting anyone care. The weight of that sat between them. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. There's an old barn outside the city, he said suddenly. I've been fixing it up, quiet place. Birds come in the morning, there's a stream nearby. She smiled faintly. You're building something. I don't know what yet, maybe just a place to breathe. Sounds like you're making a home. He hesitated, then glanced over. Would you come see it sometime? The question wasn't casual. It sat in the air, vulnerable and tender. I'd like that, she said. He looked down, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, something unspoken softening in his chest. That weekend, Mara borrowed a friend's old truck and followed Nathaniel's careful directions an hour outside the city. The road narrowed to gravel, then dirt, winding through quiet woods and open sky. The barn stood at the edge of a clearing, half covered in ivy, the roof patched with mismatched shingles. There were rows of tools leaned against the side, a rough vegetable bed planted with more hope than skill, and a wooden chair under a tree that looked like it had held many evenings of quiet thought. Inside, the space was sparse but warm, a small cot, a shelf of books, a kettle perched on a rusted stove. There was something reverent about it, something earned. It's not much, he said. It's honest, she replied. They walked to the creek together. She took off her shoes and stepped into the cold water. He stayed on the bank watching her, the sunlight catching in his beard, softening his features. I thought you were a ghost, she said, stepping back onto the rocks to dry her feet, when you first came into the clinic. I was, he said, but you didn't treat me like one. She sat beside him, maybe because I know what it's like to haunt your own life. He glanced at her, the weight of her words anchoring something between them. And now. Now I try to show up, she said, even on the hard days. He reached for her hand, tentative at first, but she didn't pull away. Their fingers curled together like it had been inevitable. I want to come back, he said quietly. Not just to the city, to life, to people. I want to stop hiding. She squeezed his hand. Then do it, no one's stopping you. He turned to her, eyes vulnerable. You're the first person who's looked at me and not seen what I left behind. I see what you're choosing now, she said. That matters more. They stayed like that for a long while, the birds in the trees above them, the creek murmuring its song through the stones. When they drove back later that evening, the city lights blinking into view, he looked more solid beside her in the passenger seat. Less like a man stitched together from silence and shame. He didn't vanish after that. He started helping around the clinic, quietly, unofficially, fixing leaky pipes, replacing old bulbs, organizing supplies. The other nurses didn't ask questions. They just saw how Mara smiled more when he was around, how he lingered when she laughed. She never called him Nathaniel around others. To them, he was just Tom, and that was enough. The nights grew warmer, the air softened, and the man who once vanished from the world began showing up in small, steady ways, in quiet offerings, in presence. He was building something new. And this time he wasn't doing it alone. Autumn arrived slow and golden, brushing the city in soft light and long shadows. Trees shed their leaves like quiet offerings, and the clinic windows fogged up a little earlier each evening. The kind of season that makes you nostalgic for things you haven't lost yet. Nathaniel had been helping at the clinic for over 2 months now, never officially. There were still too many questions that couldn't be answered and some truths that needed more time to ripen, but he was there. Every morning before opening, sweeping the entryway, every night walking Mara home. He started showing up to local food drives, helping set up cots for overflow shelters, carrying supplies for the elderly couple who lived on the 3rd floor above the barber shop. People in the neighborhood began to greet him with casual nods, recognizing the steadiness in him even if they didn't know his past. Mara never asked for more than what he offered, but she saw it all, the way he lingered near the entrance before stepping in, the way he watched the clock and the street in equal measure as if bracing for something. Still, his hands grew gentler, his silences shorter. Then one Thursday afternoon, while Mara was finishing a vaccination record, she saw him in the hallway talking to a child, maybe 7 or 8, with one arm in a sling and eyes too big for his frame. Nathaniel was crouched beside him, listening intently as the boy spoke in earnest, mimicking superhero stances with his good arm. Mara watched from a distance, something catching in her throat. Nathaniel smiled, not a half measure or a guarded gesture, but a real one, soft and wide. When the boy was called into the exam room, he patted Nathaniel's shoulder like they were old friends. Later, Mara found him out back, sitting on the low step near the generator. "You're good with kids," she said, handing him a cup of coffee. He looked up, a quiet ease in his eyes. "I didn't know I would be. You have a way of listening that makes people feel safe. Maybe because I know what it's like to be afraid to speak." She sat beside him, the autumn air wrapping around them. "You're not afraid anymore." He took a slow breath. "I think I'm ready." "For what?" "To come back," he said, voice steady, "not just as Tom, as myself." She turned to him, her expression unreadable at first. "That's a big step." He nodded. "I've spoken to a lawyer, one who still believes I had good intentions when I left." "You did," she said, "even if you didn't always get it right." "I'm prepared to face whatever comes. I don't want to disappear anymore." She looked down at her hands. "People will talk, your name will be in the news again." "I know," he said, "but I want the truth out there, the whole story, and I want to tell it myself." She reached for his hand. "Then I'll be beside you." He blinked. "You will." "Of course." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Why?" "Because you stayed," she said, "because you chose something better when you didn't have to." He swallowed. "You saved me, Mara." "No," she said, "you let yourself be found." 2 weeks later, the story broke, not as a scandal, but as something stranger, softer. A redemption that didn't fit the usual narrative. Former billionaire Nathaniel Reed had reappeared, alive and penitent. He donated most of his estate. He was cooperating with authorities. He was living simply, aiding the community. The photo that accompanied the article was grainy, clearly taken by a neighbor through a screen door. But it showed Nathaniel standing beside Mara, a crate of supplies in his arms, his smile unguarded. Her hand rested on his shoulder like it had always been there. Some called it a miracle, others dismissed it as performance. But in a quiet room in the clinic, away from headlines and cameras, it simply felt true. The months passed, people kept coming, the clinic remained a haven. Mara stayed at the front lines, measured, compassionate, quietly radiant in her strength. Nathaniel was still there, not as a ghost but as a man with dirt under his nails and a past he no longer feared. He still fixed leaky sinks, still brought her tea, still underlined quotes in second-hand books. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, he brought her a note folded into the pages of a dog-eared novel. It read, "Some wounds you taught me how to heal, the rest I learned to live with, but all of them led me to you." She found him outside, watching the snow gather in the branches. "You're sentimental," she teased. He turned to her, eyes shining, "Only with you." They didn't kiss, not then, but he took her hand and she leaned into him, and it was enough. Everything unspoken between them didn't need language anymore. It lived in their shared rhythm, in the way they showed up for each other, again and again. And beneath the soft hush of falling snow, the nurse and the vanished billionaire, no longer broken, no longer hiding, stood together whole.